Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council, and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see a sharing and a closeness of spirit. Each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them for an hour or so around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Esther Ottaway, who will be reading poems and talking with me on the theme of autism, ADHD, and gendered diagnosis. But first, the usual acknowledgement of country. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. You can hear the bird sounds in the background. Esther is recording from Hobart in Tasmania. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, of the Wallamita people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and also of the Palawa and Muanina peoples, the traditional custodians of the land of Nipaluna, Hobart, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. Esther Ottaway is the winner of the 2022 Tim Thorne Prize for Poetry and People's Choice Award in the Tasmanian Literary Awards, and she also holds multiple national and international prizes and shortlistings, including the Montreal, Bridport, Mslexia, MPU International, and Tom Collins Prizes. She is noted for her powerful poems about women's experiences, including birth, motherhood, and divorce. She has co-edited Australian Poetry Journal, published widely in leading national and international journals, judged competitions, and is widely anthologized, including in 30 Australian Poets, University of Queensland Press. Her new collection, from which she'll be reading today, is She Doesn't Seem Autistic, Puncher and Wattmann 2023. And she's co-editing a new anthology, Raging Grace, Australian Writers Speak Out on Disability, with Kerri and Andy Jackson. Hi, Esther, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Before turning to your theme of autism, ADHD, and gender diagnosis, I want to start by asking some general questions. So you'll be reading poems from your latest book, She Doesn't Seem Autistic. In the foreword to the book, you refer to the severe difficulties you have had all your life. What was your path to poetry? How did you find poetry, or how did poetry find you?
Yeah, really good question. So, as you know, people on the spectrum struggle in various ways, but they can also be gifted in certain ways. And so the one gift I have is what's known as hyperlexia. And I think perhaps many poets have this, and it's an innate or very early, unusually early ability to engage with language, to read and to compose. And so Mum has little, poems that I wrote when I was 4, like, little things that I was already generating. And I don't really remember learning to read. I just kind of knew how to do it. And, it was, I sort of absorbed things like punctuation and syntax very, very quickly. And so that gift sort of carried me through school in a way. I had a lot of sensory processing trouble at school. I had some social difficulties at school. I had very high anxiety, none of which there was a name for in the 70s and 80s, but I had this intellectual grasp and I had an ability to write. And I think that's what got me through, with pretty high marks in school. Then when I was probably 19, I'd been working for a couple of years and had really pushed myself with my health in terms of denying that I had any disabilities or any difficulties and just trying to work full time and go to the gym 3 times a week and, you know, kind of do everything that everyone else seemed to be able to do. And so then when I was 19, I got sick with a virus and had a breakdown, you know, physical and mental breakdown because of the stress of having undiagnosed autism that wasn't being supported. So then I sort of everything in my life went away. Like I wasn't working for a time and I wasn't socializing for a time, but what I had was poetry. And so at 19, that's when my craft, pardon me, I think my craft sort of blossomed as I had this almost imposed spaciousness where I was at home, you know, often in my own company, and could be quite self-reflective and could also work in the sense of working on my craft and feeling like I was progressing and making something even though I was in a difficult place with my health. So yeah, that's poetry, very much a lifeline.
That's interesting. So each of the poems in the book has a subtitle referencing a feature or aspect or condition related to autism. I had no idea there were so many related and overlapping conditions. Can you say something about them, how they interact and how they can affect people with autism?
Yes, for sure. So you're not alone there, David. Most people, I think we know about autism as a social difficulty, and we don't really know that it actually carries a huge amount of overlapping physical conditions and mental conditions and things like eating disorders. There's this whole, and that's why actually it's called a spectrum. It means that you have a constellation of conditions that can occur in people on the spectrum. And it makes life incredibly complex because you can imagine if you have one condition, well, that's quite a thing to deal with. If you have 2 or 3, that's getting a bit burdensome. If you have, you know, 10 to 12, which is quite typical for people on the spectrum, then if it's not one thing affecting you today, it's the other, you know, 10 things. So it becomes your life becomes quite hemmed in as an autistic person because, you know, between sensory deficits, the eating problems, the sleep disorders, the awareness disorders in terms of processing visuals and sound and social cues. The world is hard, life is hard, and we're not physically strong people either. We often have dysautonomia, which means our blood pressure doesn't regulate well, our breathing doesn't regulate well. We know now that the limbic system, which is the fight or flight system, is permanently switched on in people with autism. So the body is constantly in this overwhelmed overdrive state. And so trying to do anything from that state is a huge effort. So yeah, that was certainly a driver for me in writing this book, was to talk about what the whole package of being on the spectrum is actually like, and that it is much, much more pervasive than just a social disability.
Well, that kind of segues into the next question because, or the next comment, because the book shows us so many different ways that works. And you mentioned in the foreword that you wanted to show readers a profile of autism that we would not be familiar with. You certainly do that of an autistic girl and woman. When I read it, I felt that it was almost a guidebook or a map or an instruction manual. Did you conceive it as any of those things?
Yes, I love those words. That's exactly what I wanted it to be. And that's why I wrote it in poetry too, Dave. Like there is information percolating through about autism and about how it affects girls and women, but it's very new and it's very medical. And so it's dry clinical language that doesn't really tell you what those experiences are like. Whereas as a poet, I have access to this richness of language and ability to convey complex experience. And that's exactly what this topic needs. You know, it needs a complex medium like poetry to kind of lift you into the space of what those intersecting disabilities are like. So it was very affirming for me to write this work, because these are things that I've carried invisibly for all my life. And it's really only now in my daughter's generation, as she was diagnosed, that there's a wave now of women my age who are having their children receive a diagnosis, looking back at their own life and recognizing, this is what has been affecting me my whole life that I've never had a language for. So you're right. It's very much a map. It's a guidebook. It's a sort of a life raft, I hope. It's been described by someone else as something of a dictionary as well, So yeah. I do want to. It's very much about communicating that these range of disabilities exist, and that constitutes autism.
Well, it gives it a human face, which many of us don't see.
No, absolutely. And particularly in girls and women who are more skilled at what is called masking. So because girls are socialized to be socially aware and to be not too much trouble socially, not to act out, girls will pick up and copy the social cues, of people around them, and they'll stop talking about their own experience. They'll stop speaking up and saying, I'm incredibly anxious here, or I'm overwhelmed by all these bright lights and sounds, or I'm feeling nauseous because I can't eat at all because of my eating disorder today, or I'm in pain and I can't walk because of my connective tissue disorder. That stuff is said when they're about 7 to 9 years old. But then if there's no response to that, if there's no proper diagnosis, it all becomes hidden and becomes shameful because the girl or woman doesn't have a language to put around it. So this masking, and you showed the cover of the book there, Dave, it shows a woman sort of probably my age with this Barbie doll obscuring her face. And that's very often what we see as a culture when we look at women who look like I myself look, reasonably well put together and reasonably functional. You would not be able to tell, even in the way I speak, probably that there's this backlog of difficulty that I carry. And so as we know, with any experience, abuse or any traumatic experience, when that is denied, then it becomes a double cost to the person, a double injury to the person. And so I feel like because I'm a writer, this is my role, is to give voice to these women and girls.
So in a way, you spent your life up until this sort of moment of making it public, internalizing all this stuff, and in a way, it's kind of you've been acting all the time, and that must be exhausting.
Yeah, it is. It is exhausting, and it is also very lonely because for much of my life, I've known that people don't really know me, and part of that is because it's hard for me to have language to talk about these things. But part of it also is it's so complex having conditions on the spectrum that you can't fit it into a little social context where you see someone for 3 minutes and, how are you going? And, it doesn't really lend itself to that because it's so, how could you tell people about 10 or 15 conditions, in that 30, 40 seconds? So there's this duality where, and they call it actually an uneven profile is what you see in autism. So you will see some very great abilities in certain areas, and then you will see some very great disabilities. And what happens is that people tend to see only my abilities, and the disability, I guess, happens at home when I'm not out socializing, when I'm not at the book launch, when I'm not at the festival, when I'm in bed, because of the exhaustion of, as you say, that acting. So I'm at a point in my life now, I'm 47, I'm trying to start to talk about these things, and that's a big step forward for me. But I'm also trying to be a little bit more authentic in the way I engage with the world, but I still haven't quite figured out, to some extent how to do that. And I recognise too that not everyone can hear the message. Some people have some perception around disability, and they're able to perceive when I talk about this side of my life, they're able to perceive that there's something more going on for me. But some people are not able to perceive that. And so, you know, there's an element of judgment, I guess, in terms of how I approach all this. But really, there's some poems in the book that there's one titled "How Are You?" and it's me trying to answer the question, "How am I?" And really, it takes that 84-page book to answer the question, "How are you?" Yeah.
Now, I know from my own experience that humans have a profound need to be seen in all their complexity and vulnerability. But there are so many barriers to that happening, whether the fear of making ourselves vulnerable by revealing ourselves, as we've just been talking about a little bit, or the tendencies that we have to look away when people do, rather than to look at. In this book, you've basically said, enough, I want to be seen. How important is this book to you in making women with autism more visible?
So when you Google books about women with autism, if you go to Amazon and have a look at books with women on women with autism, you get about 20 books in the whole world. So that tells me there's this massive gap in the literature. There's a massive hole where women and girls with autism are not represented. And so for me to write this book, and now there are 21 books, you know, I think it's important. I hope it's, and I've had already feedback, back from women on the spectrum who say they've laughed, they've cried, they've seen themselves. You know, it's incredibly validating to have these experiences articulated, and not just in a dry medical way, but in a way that's full of life, I hope. And like you said, puts a face and a personality to the experience.
That was going to be my next question. Has the book been finding its way to autistic readers? And if so, what responses have you had? Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Yes, it's interesting too how even when I share just some of this information with people who are not on the spectrum, sometimes they are able to identify, you know, they've been the ones who've gone, oh, I'm going to pass this book on to my school friend that I've known for 30 years. And I feel like this is exactly what she's been going through.
Oh, all right.
Yes. So that's lovely too, because it means that there's almost this bridging group who are taking on board the awareness of the conditions that I'm talking about, and then are able to help their friends. And that's a really lovely benefit, I think. And like with all hidden things, the more we unpack them and have a look at them and share them, the better it is for everyone.
I haven't checked. Have there been any reviews of the book yet?
Yes. So Magdalena Ball wrote a lovely review for Compulsive Reader. And I think she opens it by saying, I don't think I've read anything like She Doesn't Seem Autistic. So in terms of, she talked about it being poetry, and so a work of art, but equally a work of information. And so I'm really happy that's come across. And I worked really hard to get that balance right, because obviously I didn't want to write just a non-fiction work, but I wanted it to be as much a creative work as an informative work. But also it's doing that process of opening our eyes to things that we don't see.
We've already spoke a little bit about, you know, the demands of you managing your complex autism spectrum conditions. And in the foreword to the book, you mentioned that those demands were so high that for years you stopped socializing and writing. How difficult or challenging is it for you to do a podcast like this?
Good question. So
I'm trying not to be too hard on you.
No, thank you. You're lovely. Yeah, there are a couple of things operating when I do an event like this. I love to read my work, and I love to talk about these important issues. And so the core of me, Esther, is delighted to be doing these public things. But then on top of that, there are some disabilities. So there's social anxiety. There's a thing called pathological demand avoidance, which is almost like an OCD, where when I want to do something strongly or I need to do it, that sort of OCD pattern will kick in and I become unable to do it. I become so stressed that I become unable to do the thing. And so I have to juggle around that a lot and work hard to manage that anxiety. And I never quite know if I'm going to be able to deliver on the day or not. I'm pretty good. Nowadays I think I'm much better at estimating the stress versus the energy that I have to give. And so it's very rare that I wouldn't, be able to make an appearance, but it can happen. I can end up overwhelmed by anxiety and in bed and unable to speak. I have to take medication to be able to speak publicly. And that's not unusual. Some other people have to do that as well. But certainly that's, a part of my preparation and my ability to deliver my message. And the other worry that I have when I do public work like this is my ADHD affects my working memory. So where there should be information in a little in and out tray that I'm using during this conversation that I want to draw on, sometimes when I reach for that, it isn't there. So that's quite anxiety provoking, in terms of whether I feel I'll be able to do a good job. I'm getting better at trusting myself and doing less preparation. I know you and I talked before the podcast because it helps me to do preparation and to be clear about what's going to be asked. But at the same time, I am loosening that approach, and that's great. And I feel like it's all steps forward for me. But yes, it's not as straightforward as let's have a lovely chat, off the cuff kind of thing. Yeah. Good question. Thank you.
Well, I when I started doing these podcasts, I was terrified.
Right.
And having done nearly 40 now, I still, if I'm not prepared, I go in there thinking, oh my God, I'm going to stuff up. So the preparation, I think, we all need to do to some degree, but I accept that it's a completely different ballgame for you. So why don't we get on to doing something that you love doing, which is reading your poems. I think you're going to start off with Limbic Airways Flight AUT 101.
Yes, thank you. So this is a poem about the difficulties of just getting through the day with ADHD and autism in a society that doesn't support us. And it also references that term masking, which refers to pretending that you're okay. Limbic Airways Flight AUT 101. Welcome on board. My name is Cognitive Confusion. Our captain today is executive function impairment, and our co-pilot is memory dysfunction. With us are our wonderful cabin crew, overwhelm and self-fulfilling prophecy, who can come to you at any time. In your seat pocket, you will find a safety card. The card is in your own handwriting and includes instructions for getting dressed, taking medications, paying bills, and eating regularly. Even though you may have flown with us many times before, you will still need to refer to these instructions on every flight. Your seatbelt should now be fastened tightly around your mouth, keeping others safe from your social deficits. The complimentary headphones will deliver a stream of invective, inaudible to those around you. The cabin will remain pressurized throughout the flight. This sensory pressure will be relentless. For much of the day, we will need to fly squares around turbulence, during which you may access, on our in-flight entertainment, a game where you throw tasks into a huge bucket and are unable to prioritize them. You will likely feel sick over what you are not accomplishing. Please use the bags provided. Please note that smoking is not permitted aboard the aircraft, nor is relief from any addictive substance. Penalties apply for asking that others accommodate your disability. Please note that these excuses must not be used during the flight, particularly if you are travelling for work. You should be familiar with the brace position and the fetal position, as you will find yourself using these frequently. If you become so distressed that it becomes necessary to leave the aircraft, there are 2 exits through the forward doors leading to embarrassment, 2 exits over the wings leading to the sea of self-recrimination, and 2 exits at the rear of the aircraft leading to isolation. If oxygen is required, masks will drop from the ceiling above you. It is essential that you wear a mask to access the flow of social acceptance. Emotional decompression will occur without warning. This is a non-stop service travelling from waking to broken sleep.
So, I mean, it's a serious subject, but the poem's funny as. I mean, it's a lot of humor in there. How did you do that? How did you do that balance? I mean, it's incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of my friend's husbands came to my launch, and I read that poem first, and he said, I didn't know it'd be funny. Like, I didn't expect it to be funny, but that was great. And I'm like, excellent. You know, I think there's quite a bit of humor in the book. It is a book of difficulty for sure, but I don't know if it comes from me being autistic too. Autistic people do have really wicked senses of humor.
Yeah.
And certainly, you know, it's a coping strategy too, isn't it? I mean, we all turn to humor when things just become, you know, crazy and overwhelming. And yeah, I was really happy to find that frame of the flight directions, the announcements. I remember I was washing up and I just got that term emotional decompression.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, that's what happens, you know, in autistic overwhelm, or when the sensory demands are too much, emotional decompression. And then I thought, okay, well, where does decompression happen? Well, that could happen on a plane.
Yeah.
And then I hit on the, you know, the announcement. So it was one that kind of flowed once I got the form.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And that was going to be my next question. You know, how right did it feel when you came up with this extended metaphor for what you experienced? So it feels very right reading it. And I think the humor makes it accessible. You know, if it was completely serious all the way through, some people would probably just not want to read it. But because of the humor, you just want to see where it's going to go, where it's going to take you. It's a very, very effective way to write a poem, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad. And I think it shows that the informational side is there, but I don't treat it as the primary driver. I think it's a poem, you know, and so poetry is the primary driver, yeah, for the work.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say, I don't think I will ever think of flying the same way again.
That's right. You'll spare a thought for the autistic people.
I will.
I'm flying to Japan in November, and let me tell you, actual flight when you're an autistic person is just kind of hell on wheels. Yeah. So yeah, I'm planning every possible sensory support to take with me.
Well, look, I noticed that there is no we wish you a pleasant flight at the outset of the poem. There's no we hope you enjoyed flying with us today at the end. So it's more about coping and surviving than anything else, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that poem does give you that sense of survival and kind of just gritting your teeth and getting through. And that's unfortunately a lot of the experience as an autistic person, because our environments are not well adapted. So most environments are very sensory dense, you know, lots of sound, lots of movement, lots of change, lots of color, lots of proximity to people. And all of that is incredibly draining. We don't have brains that filter out that information. We have brains that deliver all that information to my conscious awareness. And so that's, it's full on, you know, and yeah, I suppose a lot of my life has been spent almost in that lockdown sort of feeling of just bearing up. And I say in the book, you know, I'm a member of Generation X, right, which is described as self-sufficient, results-oriented, and hardworking. And, you know, so we were a generation that was taught that disability or illness was a failure and was a shameful, you know, failing of yourself and of society. And so that's been my paradigm for much of my life. And so it's nice to feel like now I can reveal some of these things and allow them to be part of my experience, and to know that they're part of others' experience as well.
There's a lot to unpack in this poem, and we'll probably only get to a fraction of it because, you know, time is limited. But I was just thinking about your references to the self-fulfilling prophecy and the self-recrimination and the embarrassment and the emotional decompression you've mentioned, just to name a few of the things in the poem. How much of the battle to get through each day is about societal expectations, and how much is about those expectations that you have absorbed so that you are battling against your own expectations?
Yeah, really good question. I would say it's been 50-50 for me. I certainly grew up in a time, working class family too, and in a time where you didn't whinge and you didn't, ask for extra help or anything like that. And then without a language to say what was happening to me, I could say to certain doctors, I feel incredibly anxious, or I'm exhausted all the time and I don't know why. And then you come up against this issue of misdiagnosis, right? So that's a documented thing that happens to women and girls now. It's still happening, where women and girls are not diagnosed with autism. They're diagnosed with anxiety or with eating disorders or with stress-related difficulties or with PTSD. All of those things may exist, but until we unlock the underlying autism, the cause is not being addressed or validated, right? So you're absolutely right to say that about half of it has been my own judgments of myself and harsh expectations of myself and disappointment with myself, that I at times didn't have the energy to do things that other people seem to have. I haven't ever been able to work full time since that time of my youth before I had my breakdown. And now that I understand better what is going on for me, I actually feel like I do a tremendous job to do what I do. I work 2 to 3 days for the education department, where I visit families that do home education. And I love that. It's a really demanding job, but I really like it. And then I have my poetry work for another 1 or 2 days a week. I care for my daughter, who is on the spectrum with many disabilities, just as I have. She's 20 and she's doing really well, but she's still quite dependent on me for many things, particularly around eating. And I care for my mum, who's also on the spectrum. We've also worked out, after many years, I can see it right back to my great-grandfather. Wow. So I do great. I have been able to reevaluate myself in a much kinder light, and to understand that I'm probably working, 60-80% harder than most people every day. And I can now value that. And I can also now value my rest time and my quiet time as part of what I need to be able to enjoy my life. And I think I'm starting to prioritize enjoying my life. That's still quite a new thing, because you tend to be focused on your responsibilities, I think. And I've been through it's a busy sort of 15 years, from early 30s through to late 40s. You have children and parents and yourself and your marriage and, all those things happening. But I do feel like I'm moving into hopefully more of a focus on enjoying my life and taking it a little bit easier at times.
And being kind to yourself.
Yes, reframing how I assess myself. And that's a work in progress, but it's certainly much improved. I know as a young person, I probably actively hated myself because I felt I'd let myself down and I didn't know why. And now I feel that I value myself. So and that's what I hope these works reach out to women and girls who are on the spectrum and validate that. There is a poem which I may read today, which closes the book, and it's a blessing. And I'm blessing myself and other women on the spectrum for all the good, that is in them, and the incredible determination that I see in them.
You use the phrase, a game where you throw tasks into a huge bucket and are unable to prioritize them. I'm really interested in that. Can you say something about your experience of throwing tasks into a huge bucket and being unable to prioritize them?
Yeah, great question. So there's a really interesting dichotomy in autism where, can autistic people be highly intelligent? Yes, they can. We know that autistic people can be highly, highly intelligent people. At the same time, autistic people have cognitive problems. So the intelligence sort of operates in one strand, But cognitive work happens in the frontal lobes of the brain, what we call executive functioning. And so that is not where intelligence resides. It's more the conductor of the orchestra that is bringing to you the information that you need from your brain and from your surroundings at the right time, so that you can assess and prioritize what needs to be done or what's happening around you, and so that you can act in a sequence of instructions so that you can do a multi-part job. Cognitive issues are huge for me, and they're huge for most people with ADHD. With ADHD, those chemicals that run the executive functioning are not present sufficiently. And that's why Ritalin and things like that, can greatly assist that. In my case, I can't take Ritalin because I'm celiac, which is really annoying. So much of my day, some of my day is spent in an inefficient way, where I will, it's a little bit like having a mild dementia. You sort of pick something up, go to the next room, think, what am I doing here? Go back to where you were, try to find a clue of what you were actually trying to achieve. And everyone has those moments, right? Everyone experiences that at times. But with executive functioning impairment, that is a constant. And so you can imagine where something that might be funny, if it happens to you once or twice, you might think, oh, that was funny, what was I doing that for? But if it's happening to you 400 or 500 times in the day, not funny. It's really, really draining and frustrating and limiting. And that is ADHD in a nutshell, really. That's the primary effect of ADHD, is to disrupt the ability to follow a multi-step process in your. It's almost like you have to keep going back to see where you're up to, and then do the next bit, and then go back to see where you're up to, and then do the next bit. So there's a lot of time and energy, I think, that costs. So that's what I'm getting at by throwing the tasks just endlessly into the bucket, and you can't sort of get anywhere and prioritize things.
Well, I was wondering how on earth, if that's sort of like this constant, and you said that you stopped writing for years. How on earth do you organize words into a poem and then organize poems into a book?
So poetry is generally not hard for me, and this is the funny thing about autistic gifts. That writing is my one gift, and I do it in my work. I write detailed reports for the education department. I've done it in my commercial work. I've done commercial writing for many years, and I do it in poetry. And for me, for my brain, that's easy and satisfying. The business of poetry is a bit more challenging in terms of keeping the threads of where I'm at. I have a lot of trouble keeping good records, for instance, of where I've sent my poems and who's responded, and all of that's a bit of a jumble. And I'm always terrified that I'm going to drop the ball in an important way. For instance, with my last book, which won the Tim Thorne Prize, as you mentioned, I missed the deadline to enter it in the Prime Minister's Literary Awards because of my ADHD. So I saw the deadline, thought, yep, need to do that, put a reminder somewhere, didn't see the reminder, didn't act on it in time, and then it was over, And that sort of dropping the ball happens to me quite a lot, and I have to really work hard to prevent that. But it's like I'm scanning with a system that has holes in it, and so I'm going to miss things. And then if I go back and double check, that process has holes in it, so I'm still going to miss things. And then if I triple check, that process has holes in it. So there's sort of, no matter how hard I work, those things are going to happen, and they do cause me disappointment. When I won the Tim Thorne, I thought, oh, maybe I could have had a shot at a shortlisting in the Prime Minister's, but it's gone now. So, there are things, disappointments that happen to me because of that, that inability to keep track of of the threads. I feel like people with ADHD really need a PA. You know, I really would do well with a really good executive assistant who could manage and help me in that regard. Yeah, so it's funny. Poetry is the easy part, and then the management of the other things are more challenging.
Yeah. Well, poetry is the easy part, but you know, given all the sort of things that you're combating at the time, it must be very satisfying too to be a poet, to accomplish the making of poems and the making of books, despite all that stuff that's, you know, at times overwhelming.
Yeah, it is, and it's the only thing I've really wanted to do. I remember being 4 and wanting to grow up and write a book, and to have done that 3 times now is just, I feel very lucky and very blessed, and I love what I do. You know, I love both my jobs, and I love my caring roles for my daughter and mum, and so yeah, life in many ways, though it's hard, is also good and fulfilling for me. I did have that 8 years where I didn't write at all, and that was during a time of intense caring for my daughter. She had become unable to cope with school, and so in grade 3 I started homeschooling her, and she needed that. She needed the home environment. She needed the one-on-one continuity of having me as a teacher. But during that time, the next sort of 7-8 years, she didn't sleep almost ever. You know, we'd be driving to McDonald's at midnight just to get out of the house and stop going insane, looking at each other, crying. You know, she would cry and say, "Mom, I just want to go to sleep." And I'm like, "I know." And sleep disorders are almost ubiquitous in autism, but often they're not addressed properly. They're not treated the way they should be, with the seriousness that they should be. My husband, for whatever reason, and this does happen at times with men, they don't engage in the caring work of life as deeply as women often do. And so I found myself quite unsupported in those very demanding parenting years. And then later that led to the breakup of the marriage in that period. So yeah, I feel like there was 7 or 8 years where I was underwater in many ways, in a practical sense. And so wasn't writing and wasn't going to readings or being out in the world, because the demands of the home were just very intense. Since my daughter was about 16, things have greatly improved. And so now I'm more free to, I guess, live my life again and be able to make my art and enjoy being at events and connecting with poets and now with readers, which is really lovely.
All right. Do you want to connect with us with another poem?
The hippocampus is affected in autism with severe impacts on the fight or flight response, motivation, and emotion. And hippocampus is also the name for seahorses. Young are the most vulnerable, acid burnt by sensory life, cross between being dissected and being boiled, high salinity waters, nightly sobbing, the hot humiliation of the end of my rope. Colour changes occur during daily greetings. People panic me, trigger me to say things I don't even believe. Chameleon without consent, flapping pectoral fins, terror black pupils, unremarked syntax of distress. Data is lacking on seahorse populations. The only one in the seagrass. Couple of nerds at primary school. High school, the few intellectual girls. Every adult woman I knew going swimmingly. Google seahorses. There's almost nothing. Seahorses are not good swimmers, so they need to anchor themselves. Death grip on microhabitat. Same job, same town, same home, same food. Long to surf thrill waves of variety, but prying open my deadlocked tail fatally cracks my bones. Seahorses are masters of camouflage. You with your fish-gutting words. I'll say what you want, switch my flush of identifying marks. Just stop picking on me, laughing at me. Today, I'm the spitting image of the seabed, incredible at not being there. Hippocampus zosterae, slowest moving of all fish, 5 feet in an hour. Can't make it to the shower. Handwritten self-care notes, illegible in a press of ocean. Seahorses exhibit almost no signs of distress. Distress arrests the mechanics of my ability to speak. So I can't tell you I'm perennially distressed. All statuesque exoskeleton. Seahorses are so serene. While seahorses appear to be very different from other fish, they are fish nonetheless. Radio waves are made of light. An earthquake is actually sound. In hermetic bays, between roots, drifting vegetation, I hold my secrets, beige black, emerald, stone. Come swim beside me under invisible stars.
I'm interested, Esther, in how you learnt of the double meaning of hippocampus. I hadn't come across that.
I did a lot of hard research for the book.
Mm.
So I looked into the mechanics of autism in the brain and the co-occurring conditions. I was already pretty well educated on this because I've been through it with my daughter and seen it in myself. But to write the book, I did broaden my research quite a lot, and I might have just been Googling hippocampus because I knew that was part of the autistic structures in the brain that are different. And here comes seahorses, and I was like, what? I have to use that. You know, what a gift of a metaphor. And then the more I researched seahorses, the more I could see these strands that I could connect to the autistic experience, you know, being that the fact that they're masters of camouflage, that they can't show when they're distressed and upset because they're made of exoskeleton. So there were some lovely metaphoric parallels there.
So in terms of process, you mentioned how the idea for the poem came about. Then how did you go about writing it?
This particular poem, or in general? Yeah. So the poem takes factual statements from a seahorse website. I think it's called iSeahorse. And the viewers maybe can see that I use italicized lines taken from the factual website and then kind of riff off those as the lines float across the page in kind of seahorsey way. And I quite often write like that, even not in this work. I do enjoy putting some research into my poetry, and I enjoy providing a little bit of education about some aspect of nature or something that is perhaps not common knowledge. I like to seed my poems with those things, and I really like to read poems that do that too. I love that little thrill of discovery, you know, when you are taught something amazing about the world around you. There's a Tasmanian poet, Catherine Loma, who does a tremendous job at that. You know, her poems are almost like tapestries often of amazing little facts and parallels, and then she works those into her poetic leaps. So yeah, I did do quite a lot of hard research, and I enjoyed finding those connections.
So you've talked about how you've sort of made the poem engage with the flow, almost like a seahorse flows in the water. You've got 6-line stanzas, and the first line in italics is the information line, as I understand it, and it's about seahorses, and then the 5 remaining lines seem to be in response to that first line. It's like it's a question and a response, or a statement and response. Is that how you've structured it?
Yes, that's right. So so each of those stanzas unpacks the fact. So I've taken one fact and then drilled down into how that impacts on myself as an autistic woman. It's interesting that you ask about form, because I really worked, I think, to my full capacity about form in this book. There's a lot of different forms. There are, as you know, quite a few villanelles. There's at least one sonnet. So there's some formal structures, but there's also quite a number of free verse forms that I've just constructed and I've constructed them in different ways to be different containers for each message. So I really like the aspect of finding the right form, and often that form, the right form for the message, is the key for me that unlocks the whole poem. And as you saw with the airplane announcement, once I hit on the right form, the poem often will just kind of expand into that shape and blossom.
Yeah, that's lovely. What did it feel like to discover that aspects of your experience are mirrored in the natural world?
That's a lovely question. Yeah, someone commented, Magdalena commented that I use a lot of animals through the book. So there's not only the seahorse, there's a hermit crab, there's a zebra,
Giraffe.
there's a giraffe. Yes. So I think I, in a way, almost needed to invoke non-human qualities to talk about the aspects of difference that autism encompasses, because it's not the experience of the majority of people. And so in a way, perhaps the human metaphors kind of ran out for me. And so I needed to turn to the natural world and to take parallels where I found them. And that was very enjoyable too. I hope it makes the works more creative and surprising and also engaging. And I think too, there's a natural affinity when we read about animals. They're easy to identify with in a way. It's easy to put ourselves into that experience, and yet it shows us an experience that we might be unfamiliar with.
Yeah, well, it looks like you kept finding those parallels, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's funny, the giraffe, I think, was the first poem I wrote, and the hermit crab was probably one of the last. So definitely a thread that ran through the whole work.
There's a lot of distress in this poem, and you lay yourself bare, as you do in so many poems. I mean, I think that takes enormous courage. How hard was it to write, and how hard is it to have such poems out in the world and to read them publicly?
It's hard. It's not as hard as continuing to hide such a large part of my life. So both options are hard, Dave. And I'm now at an age where I want to be better known. And also I see that it's not just about me, that going back to the 20 books on autism in women, there's a huge need in Australia, in the world, for us to hear what it's like to be an autistic woman or girl, and for them to see themselves represented. And so those things, I think, became more important than my own privacy. It's interesting, though, it was probably the question I grappled with the most in writing the book. And I went through a long process of putting some poems in and then taking some poems out and thinking I'm never going to publish this one. And so, there's a lot of, and particularly because I'm employed, there are considerations around how you identify yourself. What I ended up doing was, while the works largely do come from my experience, they also encompass the experience of others on the spectrum. So I've created a composite woman and a composite girl, so that the I in the book is not in every case I, Esther. Sometimes it's I, other women, so that I could represent, the full range of experience, and also so that I could have more of a choice around what I chose to personally identify with or personally reveal. But it's I know at my launch, when I first spoke about these things publicly and identified myself as an autistic person, I had so much cognitive dissonance. Like I felt like my head had just split apart like this as I was speaking. And, all my history kind of came crashing into this moment of revelation, and it was incredibly weird and intense. I feel much more comfortable with it even in the 2 months since then. But I must say, I've been so heartened by the loving responses that I've had. Everyone who's read the work, without exception, has been tremendously supportive and often surprised by what I've been dealing with, but amazed, at what I have been able to achieve in my life, and grateful that I'm doing this work and putting out these important messages. So that's tremendously healing to show myself as I am, and then to receive affirmation is a really lovely healing thing.
I mean, there's a mixture of fragility and beauty in seahorses. And most of the poem explores the fragility, but I was struck by the gorgeous last 3 lines of the poem that to me turn to the beauty and end on a hopeful note and an invitation: come swim beside me under invisible stars. It's a plea for understanding and inclusiveness. Do you think that last line describes the book as a whole?
Yeah, I do. I'd love you to come and swim beside me. Yes, because we are beautiful people. We're incredibly special people, autistic people. There's an amazing richness to our experience and an amazing resilience that we have to bring. And when we're not particularly women, we haven't been known, we haven't been seen. We're almost like a newly discovered creature. So I really hope people dive into my little mangrove and have a little swim with me.
Which leads on to my next question. What is your hope or hopes for this book?
I hope that it becomes something that travels within the autistic community from woman to woman. I've already started releasing some of the poems just as screenshots on social media for autistic people. So that's obviously a non-profit, way of releasing the work out into the world. And I would be delighted if women connect to those poems and then share them to a friend or to a daughter or a mother. So I hope it travels widely. I think that will take time, but certainly the work that I've already done in the autistic communities here and with Autism Tas, there's a lot of, they're almost being sucked up, like they're almost being gulped down because there's such a need. There's such a need for that kind of representation.
You've struck a chord.
I hope so. Yeah. And it's the right time. It's really only in our kids' generation now that these things are being talked about.
All right. Do you want to read us another poem?
So one, there's a common misconception that autistic people don't feel emotions. And we now know that the reverse is actually true. That what happens in autism is we feel emotions so intensely and they are so unmoderated by the brain that they are overwhelmingly intense and they cause us to shut down. So it's not a lack of empathy. It is, in fact, what's called empathy over-arousal. And so I talk about this in this poem. The viola d'amore on why she avoids conversation. Too highly strung, and speech is delicate. Every note of mild concern in your voice amplified in my sympathetic strings. They do not require playing, made of gut instinct. Each augments vibrations as I hear the matters of your life and loved ones, who's in care, whose cancer's going badly. Here your griefs enter my delicate spruce wood as oscillation, as finely tuned carnivorous birds, to later swoop to tear in the cage of my skin, in my head carved into unbearably vulnerable Cupid, his eyes covered against Weltschmerz. I am unfretted, but how I fret, your lacks and losses louder in my nerves than in your own. Hear the sound wounds in my body open in shapes of flaming swords. How I cannot bear, as Mozart said, the stillness of the evening, the swelling harmonics of distress, until the pains of thousands cry through me in agonized halos. I cannot come near your troubles. I must love you deaf, afar.
Yeah, so we've had the poem on seahorses and the limbic airways, where you found, you know, the exactly right metaphor, I think, in each case. When you look to write a poem on such a topic, you know, why she avoids conversation, it must be quite challenging to find the right vehicle for the poem. And here you found the viola d'amore, known for its sympathetic strings, and on multiple levels, it seems to me to be the perfect fit for this poem, as the seahorse was for the hippocampus. I'd love to know how you go about finding the perfect fit for the poem. I mean, you've said it's research. Is it sometimes other things too, deep thinking or accidental?
Yeah, that one was a research thing. So I thought about the topic and I started to think about things which respond without direct contact, or, you know, and so I looked up musical instruments to see whether I could find anything, and I'd never heard of the viola d'amore. It was a lovely instrument in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it has strings which can be plucked, but it also has this set of strings which are the sympathetic strings, and they just respond to the ones that are being plucked. Yeah, again, so happy to find that metaphor that expressed what I wanted. And I know it's accepted wisdom that there needs to be more than one thing going on in a poem, and I think that's often true. And so I'm usually looking for a strand of metaphor on which I can hang these things I want to communicate. And I do love the self-education that happens in my research. You know, I think poets, we're such bowerbirds in terms of the facts that we collect and the metaphors that we sort of squirrel away and are delighted by. And so working on a book is lovely, particularly a themed book, because that particular instrument I'd never heard of or wasn't aware of, and so now I know about that, you know. So there's a lovely self-education that goes with finding those metaphors.
Well, you made me self-educate too, because I didn't know what it was either, so I looked it up.
Right.
And then I found, you know, the reference to sympathetic strings, and then I started seeing all these things. And the more I read this poem, I've read it a number of times. I keep rereading it. The more I find in it, the more resonances, and it seems to me that the musical terms are perfectly placed throughout the poem. I was going to ask you, is music here operating simply as a metaphor, or does music in this poem have a greater significance for you?
I would say that music is a real presence and driver in my poetry writing. I did grow up in a musical family, big families on both sides of my parents' families, and they were singers, harmony singers. So, and, you know, players of guitars and keyboards and whatever was around. And so I grew up singing, and I'm sure that was formative in why I enjoy poetry. And so when I make poetry, it's very much a sound making as well as a meaning making. I would say equally, if not more so. I have learned over the years the way sound hits the body in a language sense, and I'm better, I think, now at using those sounds to have an emotional impact, an emotional effect on you. So there's the meaning strand of what the words mean, but there's also the sonic strand of what's happening in the words I choose. And I very often will agonize, particularly in that poem, I use a lot of one-syllable words. And so I would, in my drafts, I might have a two-syllable word there, but I absolutely know that I want a one-syllable word there because of the rhythmic effect and the sonic effect that I want the line to have. So yes, I guess it's music in several ways operating in that poem.
Yeah, and there's rhymes and half rhymes and things going on throughout all of the poems, I've noticed.
Yes, I love my rhymes and half rhymes, and there's quite a bit of iambic pentameter too. Very often I will finish a poem with an iambic pentameter line because I just feel rhythmically it's such a satisfying. It feels like an end and a climax and a revelation to us as English speakers because that's such a familiar rhythm to us. And so I do often find sometimes my opening lines and quite often my closing lines will be pentameter.
I read this poem in part as explanation. You know, this is what I go through when I hear what you go through. But it's more than explanation. It's also declaration. You know, I cannot come near your troubles. I must love you deaf afar. So it's an assertion of the need for distancing, but it is also an affirmation of love. You know, I distance myself because I must for self-preservation, but that doesn't diminish my love. Is that a fair reading?
Yes, that's so beautifully expressed, David. And
I'm a poet.
I feel really touched that that's the messages you take from it because that is the message. And it expresses the central conflict of being autistic. And I talk about it in one of my closing poems where I say, know that I wanted and want to move closer, though I'm in the mangroves and, you know, I'm struggling with things. And the essential quandary is I don't want to be an isolated person. I do want to be a person with vibrant relationships. And yet there are some very real barriers to me being able to be present in relationships, particularly when things become emotionally intense, like they do when someone is ill or when there's been a tragedy. And when I was younger, often I would be absent from relationships at times like that because I wasn't able to cope with my own emotional over-arousal. Now I'm much better at that. And I think through the process of mothering, I think I've learned more skills and more regulation around that. But it's still hard. And it's still, me being a consistent friend is a really difficult thing because me being a consistent anything is a difficult thing, you know. Because my disabilities fluctuate a lot in response to day-to-day factors. And yet autistic people are known for their great loyalty. You know, they will be loyal to friends and family through many challenges and for many years. So I'm really happy that you get that from that deep reading of the poem, that it's in a way the sadness that I can't enter into your sadness and be as present as I would like to be.
All right. Would you like to read another one?
Yes, thank you. So this is a parenting one. Again, I struggled a lot with how much parenting to include in the book because, so my daughter is 20 and that's still quite young. And I didn't want it to be too revelatory of her experience because her experience is her own. So I've made a composite daughter, as I have with the composite woman. And there were some poems that I did pull out of the manuscript because I felt they were too personally revealing. This one is very, I think, universal. And I know that parents who don't have autistic children even still relate to this poem, but it's more so written for the parents of autistic children. Night vision, apology to a late diagnosed daughter. For jamming the toothbrush into your mouth while you cried and fought your body being entered. For setting you up to fail with reward charts you could only manage for a day. for scolding and enforcing consequences, for denying you pocket money, trying to make you do chores you could never do and didn't understand, for forcing food between your lips and frightening you into swallowing, for the calm, lengthy reasoning I did with you as to why you should do better, for feeling choked that you needed every inch of my personal space all the time, for praising you when you'd done something right when praise just made you more anxious, for towering over your tiny body and pointing my finger as I shouted, for not realizing after you'd gotten off a chair 30 times and I'd put you back on 30 times that there was a learning problem, not a discipline one, for bellowing at you to go to sleep, 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 for putting you back in your bed over and over, like Super Nanny said, until you were beside yourself and so was I, for denying you screen time, which made you start peeling skin off yourself in agitation, for pushing you into the bath and out of the bath and telling you to stop whinging as I did your hair with the brush you howled was sharp and the hairdryer you howled was loud, for putting back on you the clothes and shoes you perpetually pulled off, for losing sympathy about your endless injuries, for never telling my friends that you bit your mouth till it bled and wiped the blood on the walls, and that your ceaseless anxiety had worn you to a bag of bones, and that I walked on eggshells instead of enjoying my parenting, for leaving you wailing in time out, for anything I did to you to assuage my own distress, for being a new parent who had no language for what you were, for being slow to see you. I'm sorry. You are parallax, shoal, diaspora. You are percipience, cloud measurer, reverie. You are love scar, bioluminescence.
So in the forward to the book, you mentioned the diagnostic journey that you took with your daughter. If you were willing to go there, can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Yes, we had really good pediatric support. And yet I was still the person who had to identify autism in my daughter and bring that to the notice of the pediatrician. And I feel like if my daughter had been a boy, that we would have got a diagnosis at around age 7. And yet, looking back, all the signs were there, and very clearly, but no doctor ever raised with me the possibility that my daughter might be autistic. And I really think it's this ingrained, we just don't think that girls are. We think girls are chatty and bright and lovely, and and girls with autism often can be chatty and bright and lovely because they can have ADHD that makes them talk flat out, particularly when they're young. So I think the pediatrician and other doctors suffered from that a bit. I think there's still very much a stereotype that this happens to boys. There's also a lack of understanding around how girls can present differently and often much more talkatively. But interestingly, autistic boys talk on and on about their favourite subjects, whether it's, Thomas the Tank Engine trains, or every autistic person has some trouble talking generally, but less trouble talking about topics of special interest. And that was very clear in my daughter, just as it would have been in a boy. So I feel disappointed that I had to be the person to identify those things, because I was very slow to do that, as I've spoken about in that poem. And I did all the things wrong, parenting wise, before I knew how I could do anything any better. And there was no one to tell me that I could have done things better, and this was the reason why. And that's a great shame, really. I feel like with better diagnosis, things may have been different. The pathway may have been different, and less trauma would have been done by myself to my daughter. I don't carry blame for that, in the sense that support was not there for me, and I don't blame myself for that. But I do have a hope that as we raise awareness, more girls will get access to help, but they certainly aren't at the moment. I know in my work for the education department, I work with families who do homeschooling, and probably half of those are homeschooling because the child has autism. And sometimes it's diagnosed, sometimes it's undiagnosed. Very often they're on very long waiting lists, which when you're a child are just terrible. You know, if you're waiting 2 years or 3 years, that's massive in a child's life. That's formative years. So yeah, we're at the bottom of a pretty tall mountain, I think, in terms of getting girls the help they need.
Thank you. You have written this as a breathless stream of consciousness poem almost, that goes for almost a full page before introducing any punctuation. Does that reflect that the poem itself came out in one long rush, or does it reflect a release of pent-up guilt, perhaps regret, dismay, and other emotions, or is something else going on in the way that you've structured the poem?
Yes, thank you. I think it is that sense of pent-up guilt that I was trying to recreate in the form. So the form is a prose poem, as you've said, and almost unpunctuated until the very end. And I wanted it to have that sense of, as one is making a confession, things come out and further things come out, and there's not that sense of contained, calm conversation. There's a little bit of, I guess, overwhelm and intensity, that I wanted to create there. I'm aware that when I read it, I do perhaps punctuate it with caesuras or little pauses so that the sense is there. On the page, it's a little bit more, takes a little bit more working out, I think, of where the clauses sort of begin and end. But I quite like that sense of confusion, because it's talking about a very confused time in both our lives, when we were both absolutely confused, and she didn't know what was happening and I didn't know. And so there's, that sense of confessional confusion.
Can you elaborate on what you had in mind by the reference to night vision in the title?
Yes, so the title is Night Vision, Apology to a Late Diagnosed Daughter, and the poem closes with the words, "You are love scar, bioluminescence." And so I wanted this sense of my daughter could only be seen with certain tools, in a certain way, with a certain perceptiveness. And it took me a long time to learn that perceptiveness because of the cultural barriers that there are to being diagnosed.
I have 3 children, so I've formed the view that all children are puzzles that parents are constantly trying to solve without much success.
Sure.
As the autistic parent of an autistic child, that seems like it could be an overwhelming task. How do you navigate the incredibly complex and shifting shoals and eddies of the interface between your autism and your daughter's autism?
Good question. In a way, I'm the best possible person to be parenting her, because I totally understand, because I have the same conditions. But in another way, I'm the worst possible person to be parenting her, because I have the same deficits, right? And so there's the difficulty for me is being socially on 24/7. That's a really hard thing for an autistic person. We need downtime. And a child with ADHD does not give you downtime. There is no downtime. And a child with a sleep disorder who doesn't sleep gives you no downtime. And a child with anxiety and pain and distress gives you no downtime. So in a sense, she was the hardest child to parent. I know there've been studies done on the stress of parenting autistic children, and the stress level for parenting an autistic child is twice the stress level for parenting a Down syndrome child, largely because autism is so pervasive and it affects you every moment. You don't get a rest from it. So I think what I tried to do, as I observed where certain things weren't working with my parenting or with our engagement with each other, I tried to articulate that for both of us. And so both of us are quite good at saying, like my daughter is able to say to me, Mum, I think you're grumpy today because you really didn't sleep well, and I think I'm a bit hormonal as well, and so we have a nice kind of calm language around what's happening for both of us, which is really good. I think where I struggle is when I'm needing downtime and my daughter has poor impulse control and is needing to just fire random thoughts at me, and I find it quite invasive. But I guess it's the mixed bag of parenting, isn't it? Where I think all parents are the best person to parent their child and the worst person to parent their child, and we kind of, that's part of the genetic similarity, isn't it?
That's a very interesting reflection. I'll take that away with me when I next have problem with my kids. I mean, when we go back to my sort of thinking at the beginning that this was like a guide, that really comes through in this poem, I think. Is there anything you would like to say to other parents whose children might be exhibiting autistic behavioural traits?
Firstly, that I see them and I acknowledge the incredible work that they're doing. They're working 3 or 4 times harder than with a neurotypical child, and often they have these undiagnosed issues themselves. So they're doing an incredible job, an often unrewarding job. I think you have to be your child's advocate, and that's the case for any parent, but particularly in this area where diagnosis is hard to get. Pediatric support is hard to get, psychiatric support is hard to get. That's particularly true where I live in Tasmania, because we're a rural area, and many rural areas of Australia are really lacking in those things. I took Layla to Sydney to get her ADHD diagnosed when she was 7, and that was really important because I could see I wasn't going to get the support here. So be open to flexible things, I think, if you have to travel or you have to bring in other specialists to confirm things. The wonderful thing now is that there's so much information circulating on social media, and so parents are more likely to spot these things and then have the terminology to put around them. And really, unless you put the terminology around it, the pediatrician is not really going to see what you see at home. So even between the 20 years when I started parenting and now, this information is circulating, and I think that's a real gift to parents.
Okay. Would you like to read another poem?
Yes. Where are we up to? Okay. So this is an anagram poem, and the lovely Melinda Smith came down and did a workshop for my women's poetry group here in Hobart, and this was one of the things she had us play with, and so I went away and applied it to this book, and I'm really glad I did. So the title and the anagram is neurodiverse. I, nervous reed, ever so ruined. Our nerves die. Our seed riven, severed in our reveries. Undo, deserve in our derive. No ruse. Revise, undo, overused rain. Never die sour. Nerved, I rouse. Unrevised awe. Due reversion. Overdue siren. Endure is over. New desire, redo universe.
Wonderful. Can you say something about the anagram form that you've used in this poem and the multiplicity of forms used throughout the book? You've already mentioned that a little bit.
Yes, the anagram form was fairly new to me, but I actually loved taking every form I could find and applying an autistic lens to it and seeing what sort of popped out. It was really enjoyable for me, and I think the diversity of forms makes the work diverse, and I like that that's the case, because people on the spectrum are a diverse group of people, and
There you go.
yeah, and these experiences are diverse. And so I really like that each poem comes in a different container or a different package, and perhaps strikes you in a different place because of that form. As you know, with anagrams, you pop the root word into an anagram generator these days, and you get screeds of possible anagrams. And so there's quite a lot of time involved in weeding through and pulling out the poetic lines, and then in arranging them. So I've played with punctuation to make sense of these words, and certainly there's almost a narrative structure through the anagram, where I come from being a nervous read, ever so ruined, to thinking, well, I deserve, the way I'm derived is still deserving. And then there's these lovely lines: unrevised awe, due reversion, overdue siren. They are just gifts that happened in the anagram process. So they really either work or they don't. Often you get a list generated and nothing much will spring out. But for neurodiverse, yeah, I was very lucky, and they worked really well.
Yeah. Are there any, this, because of the anagram nature of it, and you're using the letters from the title, from the word in the title, and you've chosen the particular words that you've chosen, there's very subtle wordplay going on. Are there any, did you impose any other rules or limitations on the language of the poem other than that it was anagram?
I don't think so, but I worked really hard on the placement, because when you read anagrams that are less successful, the wordplay is there, but they don't necessarily take you anywhere emotionally. And I think that's the sort of next level challenge of anagrams, is to have some kind of emotional power behind what's being said. And I think that's where I put the time in on this, was to construct a little series of narrative steps that actually took me to a place of power. Endure is over, and then that lovely line, redo universe. So I really enjoyed the shaping of that.
How do you think this poem speaks to neurodiversity?
Oh, great question. Well, it's a very constrained poem, isn't it? The anagram is so constrained. And we're quite a constrained people in many ways, constrained by our disabilities and limitations, and yet operating brilliantly within those constraints. And so I'm just thinking of this as you asked me the question, but I think there's a nice energy and vibrancy within the constrained form of the anagram, which I think is fun.
Yeah, the lines almost come across as like little synaptic flashes.
Right. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, for sure. Little thoughts.
And you've mentioned the last line, redo universe. I love it too. But is that, it's more than wordplay? Is it unfulfilled prayer or wish, or what is it exactly?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. I think many of us would wish to redo significant things about the universe that we live in at the moment.
True.
Yeah. So it is a bit of it moves from self-reflection, doesn't it, out into the world. And as you said before, it's as much, while some of these things happen internally, they also happen externally, in that we're not invited in with our disabilities. We're not supported. We have to just cope in a world that is adapted to people not like us. So it is a bit of a cry for acceptance and change, I think.
Okay. Do you want to read you can answer this question. I'm going to say, do you want to read another poem? You're going to say yes, because the poem is called Yes.
Yes, that's right. Whatever you say, I'll say yes. So this is a really interesting little known aspect of autism, and it affects girls and boys, but girls more so. The subtitle here is Suggestibility and situational mutism in female autism. So for a number of reasons, often because the sensory world is so overwhelming and the cognitive stuff is not happening well because of ADHD, often girls will be prone to saying the most socially easy thing to whatever is suggested to them. And the most socially easy thing is to say, yes, okay, yep. And that, as a young woman, is an incredibly dangerous thing. And the more I researched this and looked into it, it is in fact an area of predation where it can be known in the community that girls on the spectrum are highly suggestible and don't have the skills to prevent or interrupt certain situations. So I wrote a few poems in the book that touch on this, and this is one, and it takes as its pattern the poem Thank You by W.S. Merwin. Yes. Listen, as the doctor tells us, we are not autistic, but depressed or a borderline personality. We are saying yes before megalithic medical power. We are saying yes as the specialist puts us on medication for schizophrenics. We are saying yes as the headmaster tells us our children are not disabled enough for teachers' aides. We are saying yes to the exam board that says shorter sessions and headphones are not reasonable adjustments. Yes to the pittance from the suspect employer. Yes to the fundraisers and the credit cards. Yes to the telemarketer and his solar panels. We are saying yes to the dysfunctional friend who wants all our time, and yes to the homeless man who knows which house we live in. Yes to the online catfishes and the predatory dates. Yes to the masseur who touches us too far. And yes to the man who just needs a bit of help to get on his feet. And yes, we will go to his house. And yes, we will hold him. And yes, we are soft-bodied and agreeable, perilous though it is.
And you do it very effectively. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the word yes and what it means. In fact, in completely different context. And you know, ordinarily it is an incredibly validating, affirming, and empowering word. But here, as the word is, as you say, perilous and even more than that, dangerous, is there an awareness in female autism of that danger, or is part of the danger that the danger is not always recognised?
Yes, part of the danger is it's not recognised. Usually, from my own experience, because there's so much sensory information coming in any given moment, and because there's a social expectation that I will be able to respond quickly, often my quick response is an agreeable response. And behind that, I'm trying to think about what is best to do. But it's hard to think when so many things are flooding your senses. So that pattern makes it very hard to see in the moment what's actually happening. And so it can be that only the surface understanding of the situation sort of permeates. And it's not till later when I'm away from the situation that I can see other aspects that were operating in that situation. That's not uncommon for women and young women in general. You know, we are perhaps more often subjected to situations where pressure is put on us in certain ways, and it's hard to know how to respond to that with anything other than affirmation. But it's certainly much more pronounced in the autistic population. And they really are in danger from things like, you know, the sales pitches and the, you know, the fundraisers. Not that we wouldn't be involved in those things, but there's an element of being taken advantage of. And I think that's what I was trying to reach. And also the resistance that we encounter when we try to advocate for ourselves. So me going to my daughter's school and saying she needs a teacher's aide, and them saying, no, she's not disabled enough to have a teacher's aide. And then I couldn't advocate past that. There probably would have been no point anyway to do that. But I have observed in myself that lack of ability to speak up when the situation is quite intense. And I see it in other young autistic women as well. And it's a huge concern.
As you point out in the subtitle, the poem is about suggestibility and situational mutism. That's a wonderful term. I've never come across that term in female autism. And the poem sets out a number of examples of that. Does the tendency to be suggestible and situationally mute cause internal conflict? Because on some level, you know that you're not acting in your best interests?
Yes, absolutely. And I many times feel that sense that the situation is getting out of my control and that I'm saying things that are triggered by the situation, that are cued by the situation. That's situational mutism, where I become anxious and distressed and then unable to say anything except what is being cued by the other person. So then essentially I become acquiescent to the will of that person. So it's really scary. And I can know that's happening in my head, but I can be unable to extricate myself from the pressure of the situation. It's really scary.
Yeah, it sounds scary. Well, what strategies can be deployed to help overcome or manage that?
Yeah, I'm still working that out. I know that prevention is really an important strategy for me. So I try hard to prevent situations that could turn predatory. And I try to be circumspect in spending money for, to go away and spend some time thinking about, well, is that a decision I want to make? Often if I find a person cueing me in ways that I don't want to be cued, the only sensible response is to pull right back from that relationship, because I don't feel I have the sophisticated social skills to fend off things. So yeah, I think it's prevention and withdrawal from those pressure situations. It does get better with time and with age. I feel like I manage those situations much better now because I have more insight and experience than I did when I was younger. But I do still feel like it's an area where I have to take extra care of myself for sure.
It's made me feel a bit self-conscious actually, because I've been reflecting on the podcast, and I'm throwing questions at you, and am I cueing you to say yes?
Oh, well, it's kind of you to think of that. This is a really non-threatening and
Oh,
lovely
good.
situation, so I'm really comfortable. So yeah, thank you. But it is a really important thing to know if you have an autistic friend that they may at times agree to things that they don't 100% want to do. And that can be even in small ways. Because of the mutism, it becomes hard for us to speak up and say what we actually prefer when there's a conflict involved. And so knowing that when you have an autistic person in your life, I think they would greatly appreciate being checked in with, as you've just done with me now, which is really nice, checked in with to see how that's going. Having said that, interestingly, if I was being affected by situational mutism and you just checked in with me then, I would have said, yes, I'm fine. And I may not be fine, right? So it's a multi-layered thing. Yeah. So even checking after the fact, send a little email a couple of days later and say, hey, did you actually want to do that? Or how are you feeling about that?
Yeah. It's tricky. Is there anything more you'd like to say about suggestibility and situational mutism?
I think mutism has affected me a lot in terms of what I would like to contribute to situations and haven't been able to. So often what will happen is the situation becomes emotionally intense or conflict-filled, and that shuts me down into kind of seahorse exoskeleton mode, and the mutism then affects me. And so I then have that dissonance between I want to be, say, socially involved and empathetic to the person or expressing my view on something, but I am literally unable to do that. And that affects me a lot more than people think or might think, because I do come across, I think, as quite capable of talking. And in a low pressure situation, I am really capable of talking. But to have friends around me who understand that some insight is needed and some further checking in is needed, it's a great gift, I think.
Okay. Now, you talked earlier on about sort of the cognitive issues. I think the next poem that you're going to read is right on point with that.
So this is about ADHD. I didn't get the memo. Or I get the memo and lose it. Or I read the memo too quickly and misunderstand it. Or I understand the memo but miss that it refers to today. Or I go to another room looking for what I need for the memo but don't know why I'm there. Or I gather everything the memo tells me I need, then leave it in the hallway. Or I put the things in the car, then leave them in the car. Or I go to wear what the memo tells me to, but I've washed it and forgotten to hang it out. Or I remember the memo in the toilet, but forget it at the desk. Or I write the memo on a sticky note and put some books over it. Or I text myself the memo, but don't check my messages. The memo slides like oil through my fingers. The memo is chiseled onto an ice sculpture, melting. The memo is written on spinning plates. The memo becomes butterflies and I have no net. The memo practices social distancing.
Well, that says it all. Look, I want to say, Esther, that I didn't get the memo either.
Right.
I think this is such a relatable poem because most people experience this at times, as you've said, in some form or other, when things get stressful or out of control. But for people with ADHD, it sounds like this is the norm. This is something that they grapple with constantly. Is that right?
Yeah, constantly. Yep. And it's humiliating and embarrassing when you're the person that is late, that has forgotten the stuff, that didn't return the call, and it makes you look like you're not committed or you don't care. And that's hard because the reality is that I'm strongly committed to what I want to do and I do really care. But there are gaps, as I said before, in my process of checking. And then if I check again, there are gaps in that process of checking. And then, so there are always going to be things that slip through the net with ADHD. And yeah, it's hard. And I think it's demoralizing when people criticize you for being late or for missing a deadline or whatever, when in fact you've worked so hard at the other 99% of things that you have got in on time and you have, had the right equipment, and but all that is noticed really is the omissions. That's pretty tough. And again, it's a humorous one, that kind of shows the semi-madness of living with a brain that works like that.
Is it something that you're able to accept about yourself, or does it just remain constantly frustrating?
Yeah, constantly frustrating. Yeah. Takes a huge amount of my time and energy checking and rechecking and putting things in certain places so that I remember them, and going back through emails to see what I haven't responded to because at the time my brain couldn't process it. And so I probably do things 2 or 3 or 4 times longer than most people do to do tasks because I have to do that checking process all the time. So yeah, really frustrating.
But are you able to accept that, that is who you are?
I haven't got a choice. It's hard. I think when I let people down, like I forgot to meet a dear friend for coffee the other day. We arranged to do that and I just forgot. And often I forget things that are novel. So if I do a certain thing every Monday, I'll be there and it'll be fine. But if I do just a random meet you for coffee and I don't see you for a couple of months, then that tends to slip through my brain because it's not a consistent thing. And I don't know now how to sort of respond and repair that with her, because it seems a bit hurtful to be forgotten. I understand that that's not a nice experience to have. And I struggle a bit with, well, should I say, actually, this is a huge deficit for me and that was affecting me that day and this is what happened? Or should I just apologise and, recognise that there might be hurt feelings from her side as well? So, yeah, it's a tricky one.
I mean, one of the things that, and we've mentioned it already, that comes through in this poem and throughout the book is exhaustion.
Mm.
I mean, I'm not saying I got exhausted reading the book, because I didn't. It really thrilled me and entertained me all the way through. But I felt through the poems the exhaustion, that the demands of daily living are so great and the obstacles to be overcome so many that it takes an enormous amount of energy just to function. And the consequence of that is a continuous exhaustion. Did you want to say something about exhaustion and how you try to cope with it?
Yes, great question. Nowadays we call it autistic burnout, or autistic shutdown. So autistic shutdown is generally what happens to me about 6 or 7 p.m, where my cognitive reserves are pretty well shot. And so at that time, I need to tuck myself up in bed with comforting textures and nice little drink and, watch my repetitive shows and, do things that are very low demand. The other interesting thing is, so now we have those names, cognitive, autistic shutdown and autistic burnout. Back when I was 19, the only name available was chronic fatigue syndrome.
Mm.
So that's what I was diagnosed with when I was 19, and got sick and had a breakdown at that point. It was chronic fatigue syndrome. And that was not untrue, that was a true description of what was happening, but it didn't excavate the real reasons behind what was happening to me. In my grandfather's generation, back in the 40s, the 50s, it was called a nervous breakdown.
Mm.
Yeah, so my pa had a nervous breakdown in his early 40s and wasn't able to work he had a demanding job in the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra. He was a brass player and arranger, very brilliant, so very, very gifted in his particular gift, which was music, but really struggled with daily life for all those reasons. And so in his 40s had this breakdown and then had a complete rest for some months and then moved into a small home business for his work. So it's interesting how generationally, it's had different names: nervous breakdown, chronic fatigue. Now we're just beginning to say autistic shutdown, autistic burnout, but most people still haven't heard those terms. They don't really know, that is a thing. Most people, I think, don't really get how much rest I have to have, because I look quite alert and bright and, kind of chat okay when you see me. But if you lived in my house, you would see a lot of hours of rest as well as a lot of hours of hard work to get through my responsibilities in my day. Yeah.
I hope this podcast is not too hard, but you can rest up afterwards.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I'm really enjoying the conversation and the insight that you're bringing into the conditions that I have. I really appreciate it.
And we have one more poem.
Wow. So this closes the book. It's the one I mentioned earlier, which is a blessing. The Autistic Woman's Self-Compassion Blessing. Lay down the telephone. May wheeling birds speak your messages. Lay down your medical advocacy. May pink robins nest in your Centrelink forms. Lay down your 12-hour productivity. May your bed be praised, scented with spices. Lay down your friendship anxieties. May the words you said be received like bouquets. Lay down the baggage of completion. May quokkas carry away your unfinished projects. Lay down the grout cleaner. May books and waratah bloom in unswept corners. Lay down the good mother's drivenness. May children grow strong by your fountain of loyalty. Lay down the body shield of silence. May chosen friends give ear to your simple needs. Lay down the paper doll of stereotype. May fierce determination create your singular success.
And it's a wonderful way to end the book. Can you say something about why you wanted to end the book with this poem?
Yes, it's written to myself, I think. I really wanted a blessing and a benison, a kind of balm to all this exploration of difficulty. And there is a lot of difficulty into which I take the reader. And so I wanted to explore this idea of self-compassion that most, certainly all autistic women my age, have a lot of baggage of shame associated with having disabilities and having to hide those. And so to bring self-compassion in and to apply and give yourself the soothing things that are needed is a new skill for us. And I really wanted to encourage that and explore that.
I was wondering whether this poem and the book as a whole is kind of like a gift to your daughter.
Yes, I'm glad you said that. Yes, it's really interesting in that she at the moment hasn't read it. And she's not ready to read it, and that's absolutely fine. We've talked at length about this book as I've been preparing it, but it is in many senses a love letter to her. It touches on my own failings and my wishes that things had been different, and there are quite a few love poems to the daughter in the collection. And just having awareness of autism is the greatest gift to her. It's something that my generation never had. And I see in herself and in her peers, her autistic friends, it's hard to be told at 15 that you have a lifelong disability, set of complex disabilities. But at the same time, they don't blame themselves because they have an external context. They know this is a real thing. It happens to a certain percentage of people. They can connect online with people in that community. So they have the gift of awareness and understanding. And so that's really the greatest thing. Yeah.
You mentioned that this poem is like a note to self. I think we all write poems like that. Do you think this is a poem that you will return to and read just to draw strength for the next challenge?
Yes, it is one that it did affect me emotionally to write it, because I do, I don't know if it's an autism thing, but I do process things fairly logically, I think, and don't always bring love to the situation when it comes to myself. And yes, it is almost like a self-direction, a letter to myself, isn't it? To remember, to take care of myself and appreciate myself.
Yeah, I wrote a poem like that once called Instructions for Forbearance. So,
oh, beautiful.
Instruct yourself.
Yes, right.
How hard has it been for you to get to a point where you cut yourself some slack and allow yourself some self-compassion?
Yeah, it's the work of my lifetime, really. And I feel like I'm just at the start of it. I feel like the second half of my life will be about that, about rewiring those thought patterns of concern and working out the knotty problem of how do I get back to my friend that I failed to show up to, to have coffee with, because I want to work out better solutions to many of my tricky situations and lacks. And what I find when I do talk to my friends about how these things affect me, often I find that it's not been a big deal for them at all. It's perhaps something that I have felt that triggers my lifetime of feeling like a failure, when in fact on their radar it's quite a small thing. So that, I hope to be much more healthy in terms of how I relate to myself.
I mean, if they know the person you are, they'll be forgiving, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think too, it's a little bit of a test of a friend in a way that, you know, are they a person who genuinely can accept that I do have some difficulties and that at times may impact on them to some degree? If they can accept that in a loving way, then what a wonderful gift, you know. But if they're a person who can't, then that's information that I need to have as well.
Is self-compassion something that's absent a lot from autistic people?
Yes. So one of the things we have is rejection sensitive dysphoria. So there's a poem in the book, a sonnet actually, that talks about a young woman going into a room, meeting people, talking beautifully, shining, but then that night, this process of sort of cascade of self-doubt and recrimination comes in and makes her believe that she's in some way completely socially deficient. And so she never takes that relationship any further, that friendship any further. And we know because of that wiring that we're wired to be in fight or flight all the time, that means that our brains are in a soup of negative chemicals. So noradrenaline, I'm getting C. Sorry, my brain's getting tired now. But yeah, the chemicals of stress are hardwired into the autistic brain. So that means that every experience that we have tends to get filtered through that lens of stress and panic. And so the feelings that we then have are often dysphoria rather than euphoria. Rather than feeling a good feeling, we will feel dysphoric and distressed and often unable to articulate why, but it's the literal chemistry that we have to contend with. I've made huge progress in the last few years by doing a neuroplasticity practice. So that's something I learned through an online course, and it's a way of speaking out loud to yourself and doing active visualizations that gradually rehabituates the brain into a more calm set of chemicals. And that has worked really well for me. I'm really excited by how that has helped me. And so I'm much more able now to feel good emotions. But for many, many people on the spectrum, they don't feel a lot of good emotions. And there's a lot of research into why that is and into how, you know, how that can be assisted.
Thank you so much, Esther, for so candidly and unflinchingly sharing your poems, your wonderful poems, and exploring your experiences, thoughts and insights on the theme of, and your life really, on the theme of autism, ADHD, and gender diagnosis. Details of Esther's books will be posted with this podcast, so please look out for them. We'll return in a month or so with John Kinsella on the theme of environmental, human, and animal rights through poetry. See you then.